Hello everyone, I'm Gregory Day and I'm a novelist and a poet and a musician, and this is my 6th novel, The Belle of the World, and that's what we're here to discuss today. The novel is about a young woman, a young Australian woman at the beginning of the 20th century who's from a wealthy kind of rural family, a very mixed up, messy, dysfunctional family, as a lot of those wealthier rural families were, and who gets sent to England to boarding school and develops a personality and interests during her teenage years and beyond that categorise her as being typically difficult to handle as a person, especially as a young female. But there is a young uncle in her family who is as open-minded and as interesting as her, who lives on a property in the Eastern Otways in Western Victoria. And the family send Sarah Hutchinson to live with her Uncle Fernie because he's the only one who can handle her. And he not only can handle her, but he loves her and encourages everything about her that makes her difficult to handle for other people. And as a result, she blossoms into something quite unusual for the time and something that he wants to celebrate, but something which lives in conflict with the community, the small rural community around her. And so the novel tells the story of her development, her creativity, her musicianship, and her uncle's interests, and then eventually the conflict that occurs with their community in this little place called Anglehook. Transit Lounge is the publisher of this book. They're responsible for the beautiful edition, which is hard to come by these days. And my partner, C.R. Marlowe, is responsible for the art of the design of the book. Well, I think the idea for a novel doesn't come from just one place, in my experience. I think maybe for a short story or a poem or a song, it can be a kind of light bulb that's got, one direction. But I think in a novel, there's a few ideas often involved, and you combine them to build a world. So the idea, firstly, for this, the most important thing is the character of Sarah, and that kind of, I started writing poems first in this fictional character's voice. So I wrote, for quite a few months, I wrote lots of poems in Sarah Hutchinson's voice. And then as I did that and she started to take me over, then a story started to come to mind, which was revolving around the bell. The book's called The Belle of the World, and the community where she lives doesn't have a bell, which in a European sense is a typical marker of religious practice, space and time, a kind of unifying factor in a Christian and non-Christian community. But I devised the idea that in her time and in her place, a lot of those early rural communities were quite ad hoc in colonial Australia, didn't have a bell, and the kind of do-gooders of the town who wanted to Christianise the savage landscape as they saw it, wanted to build a bell tower and have a bell. And herself, Sarah and Fernie, who they came to fund that bell, decided to resist that impulse to ring this Christian bell all over this indigenous landscape, cancel out so much of the sonic value of that, and therefore they come in conflict with the town in that way. So that's a key part of the plot, the decision not to ring that typical bell. Well, I think increasingly genre is not necessarily a limiting idea in contemporary or 21st century fiction. People don't have to work in genre, but they can work with genre, which is a difference. So you can be writing a crime novel that can also be expanding the parameters of the crime novel. And in this book, I don't think this fits into any particular genre. other than this idea that they use these days of literary fiction, which, you know, is a very broad, a bit nebulous, but might mean that it's a little bit innovative. And within it, there will be 2 or 3 genres. I mean, people do call it eco-fiction or biofiction, and it is a coming-of-age novel, and it's experimental, but it's also been called a saga, like a family saga in a sense. So there's a few things going on, and I'd hope it didn't sit snugly into any particular genre. Yes, Sarah and Fernie are unconventional. They are definitely unconventional in their time. But this is a book, for me, that is a book written for the future. It's using the past, and it's speculating on what a past might have been or could have been in a place where it often wasn't, where the settlers were not Fernie and Sarah. They were people far less tuned in to the place that they were settling in. And so I think they are unconventional in that sense. Their openness of mind and their internal creative life and the way they want to connect that interior life to the external landscape makes them unconventional. But, you know, it's particularly in the 1910 section of the book, they're living in a remote place, but across a lot of the world at that point, it was such an experimental era because of industrialization and all kinds of colonization that boundaries were being pushed. And so then they're not uncharacteristic, but within an Australian rural context, they're definitely unconventional. It deals with this idea that all sound can be music, depending on the listener. So John Cage once famously said, and he is a famous American composer, very important 20th century composer. He once said, yeah, I quite like music, but I find it a bit predictable. Sometimes I like to open the window in my New York apartment and listen to the world because I don't know what's going to happen. So this is a book which is saying, listen to the world. We're in this ecological crisis where we're trying to save something, but I have a sense that I don't know what percentage of the population really knows what it is they're trying to save in terms of the biota, in terms of the biodiversity, the reality of the landscape, the cultural landscape. So this book uses the sense of hearing and making sound to hopefully get the reader to start listening differently and raise the literacy, not of books, but of the book of the country we're in. Themes emerge from the characters, from the place which is a character in the book. And the themes that are emerging in this book, the primary theme for me is about how to live now. It's set in 1910 and 1959, but really the theme is we must start paying attention. We must start listening and noticing not our own little narcissistic world, but the air we're breathing, the photosynthesis, the processes, the natural processes, the sound of the ocean. We must tune into these things so we reconnect and regenerate the world we need, because without it, we're nothing. So that's the main theme. But in terms of the plot, it's really a theme. It's really a book too about hybrids, about bringing things that aren't normally connected together. And it uses the world of fungi, mushrooms and so forth to do that in the final section, to show that these natural networks, not the internet, but the natural internet of the way nature is completely symbiotically connected to us. I'm just wanting to emphasize that in a dramatic fictional sense. Yeah, so this is my 6th published novel. I've written a few more which aren't published, but as you do. But so for me, I've had a sense throughout that these novels are, my first novel was a book called The Patron Saint of Eels, 2005, and now it comes through to Belle of the World. All these books are, and it's been my conception from the start that the body of the work is the thing. They are individual novels. You don't need to read them in any order, but they are, as far as I'm concerned, of a piece. And they're also of a piece with my music, because I make records very much about the same things, set often in the same place or inspired by the same region. And so all these books are, once again, are a network of interest, coming at things from different angles, from tragic angles, from comic angles, from fabulous angles. And I suppose The Belle of the World has a few of those different angles going on. Well, it is if you're a bestseller, obviously. And the other way to look at it is possible if you live frugally, and which I do. But, you know, I always think, and I think this about music too, for people who write their own music and for people who are writing their own books, I think it's really advantageous not to be doing it all the time. I worked in the Lawn Fish Co-op for most of the time I've been writing these novels, and various other jobs. And you get a different lexicon through being in these jobs. You get a different connection to life. So I would say I wouldn't want to be writing 5 days a week, writing fiction 5 days a week. But I do write. I write a lot of literary criticism for various papers and magazines. And last year I published a book of my essays, Words Are Eagles. So there's many ways to skin the cat, but I think you can. But it is true that often when younger people come through writing schools, universities, creative writing courses that exist and have proliferated right through the Western world, I often wonder if they're being sold a pup, because number one, often the thing that teaches you how to write is not being at a university. It's driving a truck or talking to someone and listening and by writing. And number two, if you're doing it to hit pay dirt or something like that, it's probably not going to happen. And two, it's probably not the way to write well. So I think a varied, textured life is better. I'm kind of writing this thing on, it's set in ancient Sicily and Australia. And so I'm reading, as I often do, but I am reading a lot of Southern Italian literature. I mean, I'm researching those landscapes in ancient times through to now, but I'm reading, there's a great Sardinian writer called Marcello Foix, whose great uncle was a great writer too, Salvatore Sata. I'm reading them. I read Leonardo Sciascia. I'm reading a lot of Calvino again. It's Hello Calvino. So that's kind of, my reading is always directed by what I'm writing, which is common, I suppose. In terms of books this year, well, I am a bit absorbed in what I'm doing, but there's a writer in England called Kate Briggs, who's a translator. She's known as a translator of Roland Barthes, mainly. But she's got her first novel coming out, I think, next month. Her book, she's published by Fitzcarraldo, and her book on translation, it's a kind of memoir about her life as a translator. It's called This Little Art. It's a brilliant book. So I'm really interested to see what she does with a novel, Kate Briggs, yeah. Well, I don't know what will emerge as the published next. I'm doing this Sicilian stuff. My great-great-grandfather was Sicilian and arrived in Australia in the 1840s, very early for a Sicilian. It's stuff going on there for me. And I'm also writing on gannets, the seabirds. I'm writing non-fiction on gannets, I imagine a little book people might call it nature writing, but about gannets, which I just am fascinated by. They dive into the water at 80 miles per hour, and the reason why their heads don't explode is because they have subcutaneous air sacs under their skin, which is where we got the idea for the airbags for our cars from. NASA came up with the idea based on the gannet. They're there where I live. They're always soaring and diving in the southerly winds, and I just love them, but I also love just meditating on what our relationship to an amazing creature like that is in this era. It's a pleasure. Thank you.